So final speaker today is, last but not least, is Gerry Carty. Gerry is MD of RPS Group, and many of you would know RPS Group have been working very well for a number of years with us in GMIT here, developing the BIM agenda in the west of Ireland. So the RPS and GMIT have been instrumental in developing the BIM Hub West. So if you're unfamiliar with that, please ask the website address. We can let you have that. A number of free events to raise awareness of BIM we run here at the college in conjunction with RPS through that group. Gerry has extensive experience in the establishment of reinvigoration and management of organisations, delivering and management infrastructure, as including leading strategic reviews in Ireland, strategy development and implementation of change programmes across a range of companies. He's also chaired a number of national committees, has acted as advisor and programme reviewer to third level institutions, EU government and public authorities. As I say, he's currently MD of the wider RPS Group and RPS Consultant Engineers, chairs the management boards of both organisations. Gerry is also a chartered engineer, chartered water and environmental manager, and fellow of Engineers Ireland. And Gerry today is going to talk to us about our need for infrastructure and perhaps more pertinently how such projects may be procured and delivered for best value. So I'll ask Gerry to come forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin. It's not the first time I've been in GMIT. It's the mid-80s I actually lectured part-time here, so no comments on my youth and inexperience, please. I see we've got a big audience for the last session. So I'll take you through my talk. Basically, RPS employ about 600 people here in Ireland. A lot of that work is within Ireland, north and south, and a lot of the work is now in the UK and Scotland. And so we're active in both markets. And what I'm going to talk to you about is a combination of our experience both here and in the UK in particular. Now, this is just a forward, I think. Okay, some of the projects we've been involved in, to give you a flavour, range from hospitals to Ballymore Eustace, which is the largest treatment plant in Ireland, serving over 1 million people. The Limerick tunnel that many of you travel through on a regular basis, and significant extensions to Dublin Airport. So typically, large-scale projects. We're not involved in the domestic construction sector, which is obviously the sector that's growing at the moment. So where is Ireland's infrastructure currently? This is the Engineers Ireland survey and rating of where our infrastructure is. It was published in May last year, and there'll be a new version of this next year. C is average. B is slightly above average. I was at a conference last week where this was debated, and there was a suggestion that communication should actually be in C, but that is the general broad assessment at the moment. At the beginning of the election cycle, there was a survey done which was published in the Irish Times, just a public survey. And it was interesting to see the priorities. Obviously, it was done with the view to how were the political parties going to respond in terms of their manifestos. But the priorities that the public responded with, out of a sample of, I think, about 1,000 to 1,200 people, healthcare was number 1, satisfactory public services was number 2, and infrastructure was number 3. And I thought this was quite interesting because there's no overarching process in this country for assessing national infrastructural needs, and particularly for deciding priorities. It's very much an ad hoc system. Each organisation puts forward its proposals, each department, each local authority does similar. So what will the political response be post the election now? Because we know that investment in infrastructure is low, and actually, if you look at the capital programme for the next 5 years, it's actually going to further decrease. So it's going to go from about 2012 to 2015 at about 2.2% in infrastructure as distinct from in construction to about 1.84% under the plan. So that's a significant reduction that's proposed. So, and yet we hear the politicians talking about the huge investment there is going to be. Do we know what our priorities are? I've just listed some here, and I've posed it as a question. And I'm posing it as a question because I don't think there's anything on that list that we wouldn't desire. But yet we do need to discern which ones are the most needed. I've left out housing deliberately out of this because housing clearly is something that there is an urgent need for. How does England go about deciding? It's our nearest neighbour. How does it go about deciding what its infrastructure priorities are? It has recently set up an infrastructure commission. That commission looks at a 20 to 30 year horizon, not the short-term, immediate need horizon. And that period, if you look internationally, is close to the minimum period that you need to use to plan infrastructure of significant scale. And that's because of the time involved, the cost involved, and a lot of large infrastructure projects that are crucial to an economy take many years to deliver, and once built are very, very difficult to duplicate or upscale. Within the Commission, there's a large aspect or element of public consultation, and they are going out to the public and have consultations ongoing at the moment. And out of that will come national priorities that will be recommended to the government. And ultimately, it is a government decision, but certainly we can see the divide in this country on projects, and I'll come to some of them in a moment, in terms of where the public are not engaged. In many cases, there is a lack of understanding of both the benefits and the opportunities that some of them bring, and also the weaknesses of some proposals that need to be ironed out at an early stage. And then in the UK, the proposed or expected growth in the construction industry is about 3.2% per annum for the next 5 years. That is probably low given some of the major changes that have happened and investment that's now happening in the UK. For example, the Highways programme, the Highways Agency have a 15 billion programme which is kicking off, and there are significant capacity shortages and opportunities in the UK market. To get infrastructure right, what should we do? I'm going to put a few suggestions here. I would suggest that an assessment nationally needs to be done at 5-year intervals, that sustainable and affordable priorities and the benefits they bring need to be identified. The UK Commission I mentioned have 3 priorities set, and I'm not suggesting we copy these, but the 3 they have set are the northern transport connectivity, that's the north of Birmingham up to Manchester, Liverpool, northern England, which basically feels isolated from the rest of England with the economy booming in the south and southeast, and a disconnect in terms of standards of living and capacity in northern England. Transport in London, the next version of Crossrail and other projects. And then finally the third one they have set is ensuring energy infrastructure can meet the energy demands. And I'm posing a question at the bottom of this: who does this in Ireland? or who does that role of national assessment, and is there a prioritisation process? What do we need to look for in it? Some of the suggestions would be develop and communicate the options, scenarios and costs, have a sufficient planning horizon so that we're not attempting to upgrade or duplicate relatively quickly after we have invested. Very good example of that would be the M50 motorway, which had to be widened shortly after being opened, and further work is now needed on it. Probably we should be planning for the population of 8 million on the island, and address the gap between the public's view and the political short-term horizon. So I believe we need a National Infrastructure Council, and that council should be set up on a statutory basis to input to government. I suppose in recent times there has been a fiscal council which has advised government arising out of the financial crisis. They are giving a view which is not necessarily the view that government want to hear, and it probably would be the same if we had an infrastructure council, but at least it would set a balance in terms of putting forward an informed view versus the political view. Projects that ran into difficulties. Cargo onshore pipeline started in 1999. First gas at the terminal end of January, early February 2017. Cost of the project still running. Poolbeg Waste to Energy started in 2001 on site and will be finished in about 18 months. Motorways are an example of the opposite, where once the organisation of how infrastructure was going to be delivered was improved. Motorways like the M6, which is just out the road from us here, from Galway to Ballinasloe and on to Dublin, sections of it, and this was the last section built of the motorway to Dublin. From when it was commissioned as a motorway in 2002, it was completed and opened in December 2009. So very large work can be done, provided the organisation behind it is correct, provided there is a funding programme in place, and provided the industry is resourced. And Irish contractors got very good at building motorways. The unfortunate part of that was that practically every piece of plant the larger contractors had has been sold on arising out of the crisis. We can build significant infrastructure. This is an example, even in remote locations. This is up on the Inishowen Peninsula in Donegal, just before the closing span was put in on a large bridge. So the industry is resourceful and well capable. Just to add an all-island dimension, this is Titanic Quarter in Belfast. And the Titanic Centre itself on the lift has been developed, but on the right you see the master plan, which will follow. It's a fantastic example of building an attraction that brings people, generates business, generates jobs. There was much mentioned earlier about projects and disputes. I would come at construction and infrastructure from the starting point. Get it right from early on, and you will reduce the potential for disputes. Get your contracts correct, get them accurate, build a proper information base, engage the people who are impacted by it, and try and get them on board, and work 10 times as hard as you should have to get them there, because it's worth it. Because the only thing that happens when you have disputes are the timescales get longer, the costs increase, and there is really no economic gain in that. So communicate repeatedly and do it timely, do it accurately, and build trust. So the contractors, as I said, downsized, lost staff, the consultants lost staff, and funding has become difficult to find within the industry. What's happening today in relation to the industry? The big drivers are now energy efficiency, trying to achieve carbon neutrality. And I see today where one very large contractor, rail contractor, with a turnover of $6.5 billion is saying they will be carbon neutral by the end of 2016. That's Acciona. If they can do that, a country like ours can certainly aspire to it and aspire to doing things much better. Innovations. GMIT has been fantastically innovative in terms of the BIM course it has developed. RPS have worked with them on that because we saw a need in industry for a Level 8 programme. There was no such programme when the concept was developed initially. And there are huge benefits from collaborative working and working within a 3D environment. But it's not something you would do lightly. It requires very high skill levels, and it requires people with of a calibre that are not readily available. There is an awful lot of nice pictures being presented, but that's not 3D Level 2 BIM. Essentially, and I will come back to this a little further, building models that can be shared and used from cradle to grave is one of the key changes and innovations in the industry. Managed supply chains, aligned supply chains, material changes, use of composites, use of fibre reinforced polymers, currently being used for bridges, lock gates, things like that. So a lot of changes. The application of new technologies to energy, whether it's in the home business, traffic, lean, and planning and programming, using virtual models. So your 3D space is simply an environment in which your virtual model can be developed. On one project we did last year, we built a complete model from scratch, which in a virtual environment allowed the contractor to basically demonstrate and do every task in a virtual environment where he had the construction. There was huge removal of temporary works and deconstruction at the end, and he was also able to plan how he did that in the virtual environment. And that made an enormous difference to the cost, ultimately. PricewaterhouseCoopers did a survey which they published in 2004. And it was an international survey in the developed countries. And they gave 4 reasons. They said there are 4 reasons why projects run over cost significantly and why they run over schedule. The poor quality of the estimates, the continual changing of scope, gaps in leadership, and gaps in the resources provided to deliver the projects. Pretty straightforward, you would think. The risk reality, I don't know if you can see that. That's a construction project in Scotland. It's the Raith Junction, which is a major junction between the M8, M4, M73. And I'd invite you to see how many risks do you think you can identify in that photograph, because that's the reality of construction. There's traffic daily on that interchange of about 250,000 vehicles a day. And every day, you see the circulatory routes, every day, at least every week, perhaps not every day, but at least every week, traffic has to be moved to allow the construction to happen. It's an incredibly complex, difficult, and high-risk piece of work. But it does illustrate that risk is real, and risk is both time and cost. So the level of planning that has to go into doing something like this is very, very significant. I mentioned BIM earlier, just some of the advantages. You probably heard them this morning. This is what can be delivered through BIM and collaboration. But it can only be delivered if the people with the skills and the tools are actually working together. It can give better workflow, better coordination, better delivery, reduced risks. There have been studies done in a number of countries, including the UK, Norway, Germany, USA, etc. They all show various cost reductions of between 10 and about 30%. They show time reductions for delivery of about 15 to 25, 30%. And the people who are leading these are showing that value for money can be obtained. You can get better cost certainty. How do you get there? You have to iterate your design, you have to iterate your assumptions, you have to work a lot harder at the front end of the project. This is our BIM director, Mark Costello, who receiving a BIM accreditation for RPS from the British the Building Research Establishment in the UK, which is the accreditation body. If we are introducing BIM, this BIM is a mandatory requirement on government-led projects in the UK from April this year. If we are doing it here, we need to be sure on public projects and other projects that those being appointed have the appropriate standard of education, are capable and competent. An accreditation to a standard like this provides that assurance. That's the actual certificate. If I was a client or employer looking to employ someone, that's what I would be looking for. If you have that, and it's both at organisation level and there is individual professional accreditation available, somebody with a level 8 BIM qualification from GMIT would certainly, with some experience, achieve that working in a good organisation. Some of the model outputs, just to give you an idea, this is a 3D model that is built totally from a BIM environment. Interesting thing about that model is it was actually used to examine the lighting of an urban junction, and the contractor saved several million as a result of the lighting being modelled and the lighting levels being modelled within the BIM environment. That's the junction we looked at on the photograph earlier. That's a virtual model, and if I was running this for you now, you could see the traffic moving on it, you could see the signposts as you travel on each route, you can walk through it or drive through it, as in this case. That's just another example of it. There is a common data environment required on big projects and where you are sharing and working in this environment, and a lot of the issues are around how that environment is managed and who manages and hosts the model. That's a further project in Scotland that we're doing. Also used for structures, which is where a lot of the initial software originated. So, what do I see as the key industry challenges? I think we have to work harder at convincing the public and the politicians that critical infrastructure should be given a higher priority, both by government and by organisations nationally. We have a very high standard of living relative to many countries in this country, but we have a very poor level of consensus between the public and our political representatives in terms of what the priorities should be. And we see that being fought over the airwaves on a nonsensical basis at times. For example, we all know that we need clean water. We all know that it costs to provide it. And yet the debate about what the real cost is and how it's going to be covered has happened, or is happening now, and being covered broadly by the media 2 weeks after the election and 2 years later than that discussion should have happened. We need to see a balance between environmental protection and development, a stable allocation of funding, and coming back to risk allocation. and David has talked about it, and it has been a very significant issue in the last number of years. Risk allocation being appropriate, it being reduced where possible, risk being reduced in general and managed properly. The current national approach is like that bridge in the stage of construction. It's a bit disjointed, but if we work at it, we can connect the dots and get a sensible national programme and priorities in place. In conclusion, we need to communicate the objectives and benefits of infrastructure and major infrastructure better. We certainly need a National Infrastructure Council which could identify and update the priorities and do that every 5 years. We need funding within the industry to support the development of industry, to support employment and the population growth that's projected. And finally, I would say we need to upskill and adopt best industry practice. Thank you very much.